Hello, everyone. Welcome and good evening. I'm Dr. Kate Bagnall, the coordinator of the Family History Program at the University of Tasmania. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you this evening to the second in our Family History webinar series for 2021. I'm speaking to you from Nipaluna, Hobart, on Lutruwita, Tasmania. I recognise the deep history and culture of this island, and I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Muwinina people. I think I said that wrong, didn't I, Naomi?
Muwinina, yeah.
Muwinina people. Yeah. I pay my respect to their elders past and present and to the traditional owners of the land where you are coming to us from tonight. In our Family History webinar series, we are bringing together historians, writers and artists to talk about the ways that family history has shaped and informed their research and their creative practice. And tonight, I think we're in for a fascinating conversation around archives, language, storytelling, and what it means to travel back to the homelands of our migrant ancestors in search of their histories. In the case of our speakers tonight, those homelands are Chile and Spain. My UTAS colleague, Naomi Parry, is going to lead our conversation tonight, but first I will briefly introduce our speakers. Delia Falconer is the author of 2 novels and 1 work of creative non-fiction. Her work has been shortlisted for major literary awards, including the Miles Franklin Australian Booksellers Book of the Year and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. And her most recent book, Sydney, which is a personal history of her hometown, won the 2011 NIB Copyright Agency Limited Waverley Library Award for Outstanding Research. Delia is a senior lecturer in creative writing at the University of Technology in Sydney. And joining Delia and Naomi is Judith Martinez Estrada. Judith is a Spanish-Australian visual artist, designer and researcher based in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales. She's exhibited in Australia and internationally. In 2018, Judy was invited artist in residence at Alfred University, New York, and she was the 2019-2020 recipient of the State Library of Victoria's Amor Residency at Balderson's Press and Studio. And Judy is currently a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture. So thank you both very much, Delia and Judy, for agreeing to be part of our webinar series, and I'll hand over to Naomi.
Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you from Darug and Gundungurra country, and I'd just like to acknowledge that it's Sorry Day today. So that's the day that Australians should feel sorry for everything that has happened, particularly specifically to the stolen generations of Aboriginal people, but more broadly in the interest of reconciliation. Reconciliation is a job for non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. So I just want to pay my respects on this day. And I'm very delighted to be able to welcome Delia and Judy to talk to us tonight. They have never met, which is odd because each of them is a dear friend of mine. So there's, I just thought, in the interest of full disclosure, there's a relationship there and a very particular reason why I thought these two would work very well together tonight. So the first question that I would like to lob in order that they can introduce themselves and their work is how does history, family history, inform your creative practice and research? And I'm going to throw to Delia first.
Oh, it's really hard to separate the family history from the creative work. So I have been working, I suppose, I grew up with the sense that something was missing in my family history, and that was that I knew very little about the Chilean side of my family. And so my grandmother was Chilean, and she had come to Australia around about 1930 via a whole series of sort of adventures in various mining towns, which my British grandfather owned. So she'd left Chile in about 1916, and she would never speak about it. And so this is because of a very specific trauma, and that is because her older brother, when she was 14, he was a test pilot for the very first was part of the Chilean Air Force, which then Chilean Army, which then has become the Chilean Air Force. But he was one of a very select crew of obviously very talented young men. He was a boy from the Ilki Valley, from La Serena, so about 7.5 hours north by car of Santiago, and he was chosen to become one of the early test pilots of these very tiny Blériot monoplanes. And on the 11th of January 1913, he had taken someone else's shift, although I think perhaps accidents were inevitable at this, with this sort of dangerous job. And one of the new pilots was having their final exam, and the plane didn't appear not to be working. He took it up to some, they're like billy carts, but he took it up to some terrific height, and then started to do what was the standard spiral descent. And he hit some sort of turbulence quite close to the ground. His plane flipped, and it was a terrible accident. He was clinging to the bottom of the plane, and the plane smashed into the grounds of the El Bosque air school airfield. And so my grandmother was so traumatized that she never really would speak about that history. And so I'm sure that part of my imaginative work comes out of this sense of I've richly imagined this side, as my mother had, almost like a kind of Marquesian sort of novel, trying to fill in these silences. And so in 2015, I got some funding from the Australia Council and a bit of funding from work, and I was able to go and see how much of that history I could tell, ideally for a novel, ideally for a work of nonfiction, but what I found was quite sparse, which we can talk about. So I think it will be a novel, which is why I'm taking quite some time with it. But that's the basic sort of story that I have. This this family story where I feel that trauma very much affected my mother, those silences, and I'm sure it's affected me a lot in my life, creatively and personally.
I think lots of people doing their family history have a big sense of silence and mystery, and the characters that speak to us in our family histories are the ones that have these big, compelling voids that we can work into. And so, which is a point for me to segue to Judy, and to ask Judy about your creative practice, because your family history is absolutely intrinsic to the work that you're doing now.
Yes, so I started mine. Can you hear me, Naomi?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Well.
So I started working on family history as an art form for my Master of Philosophy, which I started in 2017. It was a practice-based MPhil. And my goal was to document the apartment my family have been renting in the middle of Madrid for well over 100 years as a site of memory. So it was a visual documentation, because the lease will be over when my elderly aunt dies, and she's in her late 80s now. So I had this sense of urgency to try to document it. Pierre Nora is a memory theorist, and he talks about sites of memory and the investment that people have in them. So following his writings, I responded to it by documenting the apartment. And then I at first it was just going to be a straight visual documentation, so documentary style of the rooms. Then I started finding objects and photographs in there, and that started expanding. So the idea of just a pure documentation started becoming quite creative. I found boxes of photographs from the 1800s of relatives we didn't know existed, and my poor aunt, I roped her in as an amateur archivist, and she was in her mid-80s at the time, and she was helping me, and we were categorizing photographs into relatives, ancestors we knew and we didn't know. We started finding all these documents as well. My father, who's now in Spain as well, he came down from Asturias to help with the process and be my photographic assistant. So I roped everyone into it. The best thing I found, though, was it sounds like a little bit of a Dan Brown novel. I was in the Habitación de los Trastos, which translates to the junk room, really. It's just a small room that is just covered in wardrobes from wall to wall. They're very high, veneer, really ugly 1970s wardrobes. And on top of one of these wardrobes was a suitcase. And in the suitcase was a folder. And in that folder were all these documents from the Spanish Civil War. And we had no idea what they meant. I had no idea what they meant. But the next day I was going to the Civil War archives in Salamanca. I was catching a train over there. And I was FaceTiming my husband, and he said, take those documents with you. So I took them along to the archives, and the director there told me that my grandfather had worked in this project that the Republic had started, the Second Spanish Republic, to get all the artworks out of Madrid during the Civil War, because they were in danger of being destroyed. By everyone. So the communists were destroying them because they were seeing religious imagery in these paintings. So for them, they just wanted to get rid of anything that resembled Christ or Mary or any saint. The nationalists were destroying them because they were just bombing everything left, right, and center to gain territory. So what the Republic thought was, let's get these paintings and artworks out of Madrid and to a fortress in Valencia. And the documents I found showed that my grandfather was a 23-year-old driver, and he was employed by this junta to get the artworks out of Madrid. So that has now informed my PhD, which is, the working title is Portraits in Absentia, Reimagining Biographies Through the Archive. And I'm going to be tracing the trips my grandfather did between Madrid and Valencia, hopefully when COVID's over, but at the moment I'm doing it remotely through archival investigation.
It's so that it does sound terribly Dan Brown. So maybe after you've done your PhD, you can write a novel. But yeah, so I mean, for you, we had a question that we thought about what place means in terms of understanding your family history, and for you, it's very obvious that place resides in your apartment, and but being in Spain made a huge difference to your capacity to talk to people, didn't it?
It did, yes.
Yeah.
We were talking about this the other day, how everyone was incredibly generous because they thought, well, I've come over from the other side of the world, and they were very generous in opening up archives, offering themselves to help with the research. So I've been very fortunate. I've got a woman on the ground at the Prado Museum who is investigating things, helping me investigate things. Also people that, in sociology and anthropology have been really, really helpful. But the best thing is when you do go across to the other side of the world to look at archives, they let you behind the scenes as well. So I was very lucky to be allowed into the belly of archives as well.
And they were disappointed that you were less Australian than you actually.
Yes, I think everybody was expecting this cute little blonde surfy girl who had Spanish heritage, and they were just getting someone who looked more like a flamenco dancer than anything else.
Well, I don't think anybody thinks looking like a flamenco dancer is bad.
But I don't think you can look more Spanish than I do.
Yeah. And so Delia, you've got a really amazing story about going to about place and about being on the ground and what that meant for your work.
Oh yes, look, where to start? Shall I piece together the research journey for you, Naomi? Is that what you'd like?
I think people would get a lot from hearing what you had to go through to do.
Well, look, it was we had almost nothing. I think that it's partly a sort of it's a family trait, and I think it's a cultural trait in Chile that people aren't very sentimental. They are great chuckers out of stuff. And so there was very little that existed in the family. And then my grandmother had been very quiet about her mother. We knew nothing about her. I mean, it was an absolute silence. So, and a cold trail, because, the last time she'd been in the country had been, about 1917. So I didn't have any Spanish because, of course, my grandmother had come at the point where you didn't pass on a language, which is another great loss in our family. And my mother had always wanted to learn and wanted to know, and had always been sort of shut down by both her mother and her two siblings, who became kind of, sort of protectors around her mother and said, don't make our mum upset by talking about all this stuff. And so the dynamics were all quite difficult. And the only thing I really had to go on was a couple of things. One was that I knew that there was some family there, but, there had been, Chile is an incredibly complex country in terms of land and inheritance and titles, and it's on zillions of little mining leases, and that's a huge part of the kind of investment economy. And there was a property, and that had gone to other members of the family after the Pinochet era. So, and there hadn't been any ability to kind of really communicate there over all that time. So I had those, and I had and I knew that my grandfather was the first martyr, as they call him, of Chilean aviation. Someone said to me, fantastic advice for doing histories abroad, was to try SBS and see if they knew anyone who, because I knew I would need a fixer of some sort, and that they didn't have any fixers in Chile, but the same person had said, and try language departments, university language departments, write to them. And so I just put in, so lucky. It's when the landing lights are on with any sort of project, when this sort of luck happens. And someone answered, and it was a lovely woman who had been studying a cultural studies degree. She's an ex-journalist. She'd been studying a cultural studies degree at Sydney Uni for 5 years, and she was going home 2 weeks before I was planning to go over. And where she worked, gets better, was for a military think tank called ANEPE, which is the Academia Nacional de Estudios Políticos y Estratégicos, which is a branch of the military, but it's kind of like a cultural sort of branch, which I still don't quite understand. But so she was going back to her job there, which proved to be incredibly fortuitous. And so she was on the ground, did a bit of research for me, including tracking down being able to communicate with some family members. And I had also I'd done some South American Spanish, done a few terms of that. So I had basic Spanish, and I can read because I have French, and so when you read it, you can kind of make sense of things, but I can't understand a word anyone's saying in Chile. But that's another sort of story. And so I had written to the National Museum, the Aeronautical Museum, National Library, and everyone had said there is no archive of the early Air Force. It just doesn't exist. And these are people who are history experts. But this being Chile, and again, I think this is very much how things work there. Irene, my fixer, worked for a general. That general got in touch with the colonel who runs the air school, which is still there, the site where I've got a few photos which I can show you in a bit, but that air school is now in the suburbs of El Bosque of Santiago. And that colonel said, oh yeah, we've got an archive. Only 3 people have worked on it, over that period of time. And they opened everything up for me. And then there's my great uncle's flight manifest. I know exactly where he was in the air in, his career only lasted about 9 months, but from, in 1912, I can say he was this altitude up, he made stops at Rancagua, he went to Valparaiso, incredible. And his autopsy report and communications about all of that. And so that, and they're, apart from that, shall I talk about the plane?
Oh yes, do. Yeah.
They're in all these books that have been carefully put together with all that history there, was the propeller from his plane, the Manuel Rodriguez, that they'd actually buried the plane, which tells you a lot about the culture of heroism around and their fetishization of flight at that point, because they, for all sorts of reasons, it was more sort of around espionage and wanting to conquer the skies before Argentina did it. But it was an enormous, because they buried this broken plane as well as having the huge military funeral for my great uncle.
Like a ship burial.
Yes, just amazing.
Yeah.
But they'd kept the propeller, and so I was able to hold the propeller of the plane, which my poor great uncle, at only at the age of 20, had perished, meters from the site where that had happened. So it was quite fantastic. And I did sort of go and talk to the family as well, which we can talk about a bit later if you like. But I still couldn't hear his voice, and I couldn't hear the voice of any family members, and that's what I'd really been hoping for, was more than sort of material and that sort of documentary evidence. But I certainly had a sense, being on the ground, of what an enormous deal it was, because Marquesa it's a tiny spot on the map. I'd always thought it was quite grand from the family stories, and for him to join the Arica regiment, pass all these exams to in chemistry, in maths, in going up in a plane and drawing strategic diagrams, to pass all that and go to the Santiago Military College, and then to get into this elite regiment was such an enormous achievement for him, but such a loss as well. So I really felt that very, very strongly from that research. But I really owe it to my fixer, because there was just that knowledge obviously wasn't even accessible to people who were working in the Aeronautical Museum to know that archive was there.
I think one of the things that Kate and I were both fascinated by when we heard about your stories was the difference between how we see archives in Australia and how and England, how orderly they are, how frequently centralised they are. In the age of the internet, they're on Ancestry. We have organisations like the Mormons who spend countless hours of research trying to put together people's family trees, but that is not the case in Spain or in Chile. So I guess it's a big question about how the archives in each of those countries, and I mean as well, even though I think we think of Chile as a Spanish colony, and because our colonial experience in Australia is very much that we've adopted British systems, but that is not the case in Chile either. So what I might ask Judy first is to talk about what the situations with archives in Madrid, and the difference between when you have your amazing personal family apartment, which is an archive in and of itself, but then how that goes to how the sort of cultural space that an archive is in Spain.
Okay. From my personal experience, when I went to the archives, they were very organised. There are lots, archivists, designated archivists, but talking to people who are specialists, especially around Civil War history, they talk about large fragments and black holes in these archives. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Spanish Civil War lasted from 1936 to 1939, and then there was a fascist dictatorship. And after that, there was a transition into democracy. But during that time, it didn't suit the fascist dictatorship to have archives that showed how great in my opinion, the Republic had been. So there's still these fragments in archives, and people are filling them. So, for example, for trying to piece together this history about my grandfather, as Naomi says, I'm really lucky that I've had access to these documents, these personal documents, and I can add them to what I find in the archives. So in the archives in the Universidad Complutense in Madrid, they have a lot of information about this project of getting the artworks out of Madrid, but not everything. So I've got some documents here. These are the documents I found. My grandfather's work permits and permits saying that he could drive across the country during the war. So you see similar documents to these in the archives, but obviously not everything. And the authors of the book that I'm researching, called Arte Protegido, which means protected art, they said that, yeah, there were lots of gaps in the archive. So it took them 25 years to write this project together. And one of them was, I think they were both working at the Prado at the time. And if you work at the Prado, you want to be working for paintings, archives about paintings. And Judith told me that in a way she had been sort of sent down to the photographic archives. And that's when she started finding this information and when they started putting together the book. And people started coming forward with documents that they found, like this one. So they started adding to this big archive. But yeah, lots of fragments still in the archives. Emilio Silva, who is a sociologist in Spain, and he's in charge of a historical memory project there. He talks about the secrecy that still surrounds archives in Spain. That will, hopefully at some point have access to. But I think he's a little bit of an archive genie, because I was having a Zoom meeting with him the other day, and he found information about my grandfather in some archives that I didn't know existed. And once again, I was able to piece the information he gave me to an object that I had found in the apartment. So I think that we shouldn't underestimate the importance of vernacular archives when it comes to putting together stories and histories.
Yeah, absolutely. Those family treasures, the things that people keep hidden, can often be really important pointers as to things that don't exist, because government systems have their own way of creating things, and they decide what to keep and what to preserve. Whereas what's important at the individual level, what really matters, like your grandfather's work permit, that's pretty important. He's going to keep it. Yeah. So, it's endlessly fascinating. And I like as well the fact that, there's a tie again with an archive and objects, and we will definitely get to that before the end of the conversation. So I just want to say to our audience that we will be having a Q&A. And so if you want to ask a question, there's a little Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And if you click on that, you can type a question in there. I can't promise that all of the questions will be answered, but I will try and get to many. So we were talking about histories and archives and the creation of archives. And Chile's got a different history again in terms of archival creation, Delia.
I guess there really isn't, an archival culture particularly, and there certainly isn't a public culture of archives. The National Library is pretty good in terms of its collections and its newspaper collections, but there's not much more to find there. And I guess a lot of people would probably assume that that's because of the troubles of the 70s, and that, and that would be part of it, that, there's a lot of history that people would probably prefer to leave lying. But I think it goes back. My impression from my research is that goes back much longer, and it's more around law and property. So in Chile today, there's still there's two sort of problems around property. One is that again, with mineral leases and forestry leases and all these incredibly complex rights that people can still in a very poor economy, there's still a lot of argy-bargy around those, and people are still trying to claim and counterclaim, but the only way that you can do that is through very expensive legal recourse. So there isn't that, so it's very privatized and very, very fraught. And I know that even in my family there are some leases and bank accounts and all sorts of things that are so sort of entailed and so difficult that still sort of comes up. So there's not a kind of there's not a an interest of people who, you know, I think lawyers are some of the more powerful people in Chile, and there's really not an interest in having a lot of those things publicly available. There isn't a culture of people tracing their family history. People there found that very interesting and kind of a bit weird. I think that we were all so fascinated with wanting to trace our family histories. That just doesn't exist as, and I remember that starting in the 70s, really. You know, I think in Australia, I still remember when people started to become very interested in, you know, well, it would be okay to find a convict ancestor or whatever you were going to find in your background. So that's, but they've not kind of hit that state. But I suppose the thing that really surprised me and that complicates things even further is that, you know, my degree is in cultural studies, and I'm so used to histories of private life existing and being able to, you know, in European history, Australian history, be able to find all these marvelous resources that, you know, tell cultural histories, but they don't exist either. And I asked a lot of people, that's why my fixer had actually been doing her cultural studies degree in Australia, because that just doesn't exist as an academic discipline or process there. And the only little books that you're going to find of local history are going to be, you know, like, you know, someone's sort of small private amateur history they've written of the railway in La Serena or whatever. So there's this all these sort of gaps that are, you know, that make looking in the records really difficult, which is why, you know, why it was such an amazing thing to come across that public archive. And when it came to the family history, my again, there hadn't been, because I think there had been some, you know, uncertainty, we'll say, around the property in the family. There wasn't much that had been kept, and my two great aunts had, you know, there was the trauma that I discovered through the rest of the research was that not only had my great uncle had this terrible traumatic death, but it had sent his mother mad. So she had, and there's not a lot of information I could get there, but you can imagine for my grandmother, not only losing her brother, but pretty much losing her mother in the process of this, you know, of her favorite, you know, hero son dying, had been such a double trauma. And I think that, but that was, again, that was really only through, not through the more immediate family, but some quite distant cousins. And, you know, we just had this wonderful day where someone spoke to someone, and we found the keeper, you know, the family keeper, and there's always one somewhere. And she had kept hold of the few remaining photos. I saw a photo of my great grandmother, really a proper one, for the first time in that collection of photos that she'd saved, and found those rudimentary bits of story, as well as being able to go to the family, what was left of the family house. So, you know, that was just, you know, two incredibly lucky things. But, you know, so my advice with research would be to, you know, there is someone who will be the keeper, and it won't necessarily be the person you think, but they are worth their weight in gold.
Wow. No, it's yeah, I that is fascinating that there isn't that kind of culture of public history. Do you think there is in Spain, Judy?
Oh, definitely. And especially more so now. So during the Franco dictatorship, a lot of things weren't said. So there was a lot of fear. And of course, you know, the nationalist ones, so there were the martyrs of the war who were the nationalists, and they're the ones that were in the archives that we knew about. Now there are a lot of groups, a lot of memory groups that are doing a lot of exhumations of mass graves. So there's this great project called Mapas de la Memoria, which is comes out of Ciudad Real, which is a small city in Castile, and they're actually just trying to connect people and objects with. And the other day I came across the most beautiful story, a lot of oral history as well. So people are trying to take back their history. So those that it's that concept of a non-linear history. So we're going back and we're opening up these stories. And the most beautiful one I came across was these stones that were covered in blood because someone was killed by the cemetery walls. They used to kill a lot of people by cemetery walls. And when they went to try to find an object that belonged to this person, there wasn't anything there, but there was blood on these stones. And someone took these stones, put them in a little pouch, and had that pouch with a safety pin connected to her apron for the rest of her life. I think it was her daughter. So they're trying to there's a lot around the testimony of objects going on in regional areas. So they're giving a voice to, once again, to the vernacular stories, and remember that I don't know, not everyone knows about Spanish history, but after Franco died, there was an amnesty law, which in a way acted like a blanket of amnesia that was thrown over the country. Which the idea was that as it went into a democracy, everyone was going to live side by side. So you could have someone who would have been torturing Republicans or communists living next door to the person that they had tortured, and it would have been all right because of this law. But now that law is, that blanket of amnesia is becoming really old and scruffy, and people are wanting to know what happened. So I think we're going to find out more and more information in the next couple of years, or in the next couple of decades.
No, it's fantastic. And I mean, I'm sure that, in Australian history, we've had our own projects of recovering lots of stories in the way, particularly around Indigenous cultures, but also convict pasts and those kinds of secrets that we've had. But it is fascinating when a nation has to go through a rebuilding and a justice process to essentially come to terms with itself. So that the stones, the blood on the stones, that's so powerful. So I just want to finish, I guess, with this is our show and tell section where we can talk about particular objects and items that tell particular stories from your family history. So who is most ready? Who wants to go first?
I'll let Delia go first, and I've got a document I can share, so I'll try to fix that up.
Can I share my screen? I can
You
put
can.
a couple of things on slideshow. I won't take you through everything, but let me just see if I can do it and get these slides going. Don't worry, I won't go through everything. So it's my great uncle. Marvelous photo.
Are you sharing your screen?
I should be. Is it not sharing? It was sharing before when we did a test. Let me just let me try again.
There we go.
Yep. It's going to show. Okay, fantastic.
Yep. That's good now.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's my great uncle. Just so we know who we're talking about. And here, that's actually not the actual accident. It's a different pre-accident. It's my grandmother in mourning and her family there, mother noticeably absent. And here are the books that were carefully kept in that secret archive. They're bound, just amazing. And these are the manifests. So these are, for me, some of the touchstones. So these were you can see the creases, they would have been in the pocket of my great uncle's air suit. And you can see his signature. You can see there were I couldn't find the one with the oily fingerprints from the engineers. But I find that extraordinary to know so little and then to, be able to.
But you have his fingerprint.
Yeah. I don't know if it's his or if it's an engineer's, but there is a fingerprint. Here we go. I did find them, oily fingerprints. And there's there's his Mary, Francisco Mary's. So they were quite fantastic. And there's the spot where there used to be a stone there, but I was taken to the spot where the plane was, and that's the investigation. They're German military caps that they had, that helmets that they had at that time. And and we were on the edge of this airfield. So it's sort of surreal to see the jet fighters coming in and out. And there's the propeller. That's one of the other magic objects. I'm so moved to be able to hold that.
Yeah. To put your hand on something. Dogs
everywhere. So this is my
dogs.
this is what's left of the house. It was part of a mining claim. So my grand fantasies sort of collapsed at this point. But you could see quite, it was quite a, once upon a time, quite a thriving sort of place. And there's Maruja in the middle, who kept the documents, and she had some of these photos, but that's a precious one on the end there. It's my communion photos of my grandmother, and then there's the one photo of my great grandmother, so I can actually see what she looked like.
Wow,
fantastic. And that's because Maruja had, being a kind of the wife of a second cousin, had carefully kept these documents, and there they were, in her lounge room, in La Serena. So that's my show and tell. I don't think and then all the magazines and things, but that's there weren't many to find, but that's the photograph of my great grandmother was quite extraordinary to see. And there was her life. She just, couldn't deal with reality once after that terrible accident. So I'll stop the screen share.
Very beautiful. Thank you. The confirmation photos and those, gorgeous.
I'd never seen any of those. There were only about a dozen photos, but cool. But it's so much was thrown away.
Yeah,
and by my grandmother mostly. So can't really blame the family. It was, her choice. But you can understand why, I think, as well.
Yeah, I think most people have got a story of having to grab photos off a fireplace. I mean, certainly the case in my family. So, and Judy, what treasures have you got? You always have so many.
I've shown you my documents, but these ones here. But I'm going to show you part of my MPhil body of work. Not the whole thing. I won't bore you with the whole thing. But let me just share my screen. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'll skim through most of it because there's a lot of pages here. This is the apartment. This is the facade of the apartment in Madrid. And as I said, when my aunt dies, we won't have access to this apartment anymore. It's like the windows. And these are the rooms. So when I started documenting the place, this is how the house looks. So it looks like an Almodovar film set, lots of 70s kitsch wallpaper, religious imagery.
Oh, beautiful.
That's fantastic. That turntable is amazing.
And then I started looking at objects, so the idea of testimonial objects and how some remain. So there's all these receipts everywhere. Letters that have still survived time, objects. This is my dad's diary from 1967, and he had all these Rudy pictures in it, and I love embarrassing him with them. Look at Aunt Margaret there. And lots of photographs. I started finding rubber bands in archives, and they informed my work, the creative practice a lot. So my grandfather was a police officer after the war, so there's his badge. He was a smoker, and he died because of his smoking. So I'm really surprised that these smoking papers still exist. There's these little packets of rollies. So things that exist, the only garment that is left, he died in 1974, is his wedding waistcoat and pants. And that's him there. This little, this thing of Christ here, apparently just before the war, you could hire a chapel. You could get someone to come over and bring you this like little travel chapel. And then the war that started and nobody claimed it. So that Christ has been there since 1936.
Wow.
And my grandmother was a seamstress, and these are some examples of her sewing. They were bound in a little book.
Oh, they're beautiful samplers.
Yeah, so then I merged the samples of my grandmother's sewing and photographs of my grandparents. And then I did these collages called family biographies. We just the remaining objects I put together to try to construct these little visual biographies of my relatives.
They're so fantastic.
And it goes on, but I won't bore you with it. But it was just, it's an amazing resource to have. And it's my muse, really. This apartment is my muse. I'm going to be very sad when my aunt has to move out and I won't have access to it anymore. I'll continue to, when I can, collect these things. And this is a series I did of the unknown portraits that between my aunt, my father and I would categorise them. And those who we couldn't identify, were photographed in this style during the residency at Alfred University.
I love the way you've covered their eyes.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's that sort of sense of not knowing them and they don't know us.
Yeah.
Shortly after doing this project, my aunt all of a sudden started recognising the people in the photographs. So it just shows you how memory works. And then I did projections in the apartment as well, of my grandparents on the wallpaper, etc.
Oh, beautiful.
So yeah, that's oh, there's only one more thing that I'll show you quickly, because I thought these are redacted. These are family stories that you'd never know the whole truth. So it's this idea of some of the stories that we know something about, but that don't get passed down. So let's incomplete histories. And this is a giant print on fabric of one of my grandfather's work certificates. So yeah, that's.
Oh, so envious of all the
and I should point out that the giant print on fabric is very, very big. I saw that in situ at New South when you did that show, and they're very, very large. So they are. It is amazing to have that trove. So we've got a little bit of time for questions. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. So we have I guess in many ways that that we've already covered this, but one of the early questions, which I suppose, it's a question about, we probably won't return to this, but that the comparatively recent history of dictatorships has affected the way that the state and the individual remember things, and I think that's very much the case for in this story, as you sort of subsequently explained. That question came through at 6:30. I think we've come there. So one of the questions is that are there any Spanish online resources that you could recommend, Judy, for tracing family history, and specifically about Barcelona records?
Okay. Let me just think. So all the regions, every region has archives, and they're all online. So you can start there. I went to the ones in Madrid because I was looking for my grandfather. In Asturias, where my mother's family's from, I went to the archives there. If you're looking for Civil War information, there's the Civil War archives. As far as Barcelona, I'm not sure, but if you look up Archivos Catalanes, you should be able to find something.
That's really good. I think we have a question. Claire Robinson says that that she knows from experience visiting the Netherlands the benefit of going to the country of the people that you're researching, especially if you aren't familiar with undertaking research. But she says not possible at the moment, of course. Do you have suggestions about how to create connections with those key people when travel presents it, and how to overcome that barrier that COVID-19 has created?
I can start.
Yeah.
I am making a lot of connections now because I can't get to Spain to do my research. So I'm connecting through people at universities. Everyone's very generous, so if they can't help you, they will put you onto somebody else. I've had Zoom meetings with people as well. I'm just surprised by people's generosity. If you send them an articulate, polite email, saying what you're looking for and making sure that your information is correct. And because if you're approaching someone who's an expert in that area, they like to know that you know what you're looking for. But everyone's been so incredibly generous, sending information, photographs as well. So yeah, just approach people, and if they're not the one, I'm sure they'll forward you onto your email to somebody else. And make those connections. If you can have Zoom meetings, they're great as well.
Yeah, look, it's a different story for me. It's very difficult. I mean, I'm still in touch with some of my relatives, and that's great. But the tech isn't particularly fantastic there either for Zooming or anything. Plus, we all struggle a bit with the different languages. So, I just really need to get back and get my feet back on the ground. So it's difficult for me at present, and I can't really kind of do more on the novel than I have until I'm able to get back. But I did hear a fantastic story today from a friend in New York who's working on a biography of Amelia Earhart, and there's been a regional library that continues to be shut even to students that had an archive, and she was going to pay a student to get in there and go and do it, and they still couldn't do it because it wasn't even open to them. And yesterday the librarian has agreed to go on Zoom through boxes for her. Librarians
wow.
For 3 days of just seeing what's in them so she can do her due diligence for her book. So I guess asking, she's a good asker. I thought that was an amazing story of how helpful our librarians want to be around material that they and you care about, at least I don't think that would be occurring in Chile, but it's, in those public institutions, you never kind of know. I just thought that was fantastic.
I think the archivists and the librarians miss their collections and they miss their people. And I certainly had an experience of a big rush of engagement once I could get back in with the people in the archives at the same time. And one of the librarians said to me that they loved us because we're the ones that show them what's in the collections. We're the ones that have the stories that make the objects that they look after make sense. So I've got just a little bit more time, and I have a question from Joanna Sassoon, who's asked 2 questions. One was about objects, but I think we'll skip over that because, again, that was asked earlier in the day, and in the session you've come to that one. But this is a question that I think both of you will like, which is, why are we concerned about silence, and can we see silence as a gift rather than a burden, particularly if we're choosing to write creatively?
Look, clearly it's powered my creative life in all sorts of ways, having to stretch my imagination across to Chile for a while. But look, I'm sure it can be, but when it's a silence around trauma, it's hard to put a sort of a positive spin on it, and I'm just so aware of the damage that's created in my family down the lines. And obviously the job for me is to now, I think I've kind of come to the end of the road really in terms of what I can find, and those voices I will never hear. And again, I think that's a damn shame that those people have all sort of receded into history, and I have a certain job to to kind of recreate them. And I will do that at some point. It's harder in fiction. There would be some fictocritical ways I could try and do that as well, I suppose. But I didn't feel there was quite enough there. But no, I don't. I'm afraid I find it difficult to frame it as a positive.
What do you think, Judy?
I think silence has an expiry date. So it just happens to, when we start looking at stories, we'll know the stories are right for us to tell or not. So in the case of my grandfather's story, I feel that those documents were waiting for me. Otherwise, I would have just been thrown out when my aunt left the apartment. The reason why there was a silence around them was that it was an initiative of the Spanish Republic. The dictatorship came in. My grandfather would have got into trouble if people knew that he had been associated, potentially with that project. So silences are there for a reason. And as I said, there's an expiry date, and we just have to use our own discretion to when we start bringing these things out to the open. I have a really beautiful quote here from Marianne Hirsch, who's a post-memory scholar. So if you don't mind, I'll just share that with you.
Please.
So it's, post-memory is a powerful and very particular form of memory, precisely because its connection to its object or source is mediated not through recollection, but through an imaginative investment and creation. So I thought this is very beautiful to me, and it's the idea of these gaps in history, then we can come in. So what Delia's doing with her great uncle, sorry, and what I'm doing with my grandfather, we can fill in the gaps as creative people.
I think that's a beautiful, Delia.
The silence in South America, in both Chile and Argentina, around Indigenous people as well. There has been almost no work, and there really, I have to say, there's not an enormous amount of difference beyond archaeology there. And for me, I feel that's a gap in the story, that the staff at my family's house were all Indigenous women. People who looked after my mum when she was born in Mexico were Indigenous, and I see their photos and I see their faces in my mum's case, and I wonder about them. And that again, you need people sometimes to have done some of that work on the ground. And coming from Australia, where historians have been doing so much amazing work, it's really quite shocking, and you really feel that absence as well. And that's not something I can actually do anything about. But I would, it's a shame. It's not there as well.
I think that's probably the note we'll be obliged to end on, because we are right on 7 o'clock now. But I think that idea that silence does have an expiry date, but it also is layers and layers, and we should dig back through time to answer these questions, especially when we're redressing injustices in the past. So we have lots of questions that I haven't been able to get to, but I knew this would be a very fruitful, amazing discussion, and I'm so grateful to both of you for coming. I wonder if Kate will come back in and say goodnight to us. So thank you so much. Kate, are you there?
Yeah, I certainly am here. Thank you, Naomi, and thanks so much to Judy and Delia for your really interesting family stories and sharing those beautiful photos, and your creative work, Judy. It's beautiful. So just to finish off, I'll let you know that we have recorded this session, and so that will be available up in YouTube in due course, and also that our next family history webinar is on the 25th of August. So we've got a little break for a couple of months, and you'll all receive an email with details of that when we finalise the program. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks again, Naomi and Judy and Delia.
Thank you.
Thank you.